Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. At UFC 287, headlining the prelims, we got Chris Curtis versus Kelvin Gastelum, one of the best fights of the night. But this fight wasn't without controversy because in the second round, there was an unintentional head clash that altered the course of the fight. And we're going to take a look at that replay for the very first time because they did not show it on the UFC broadcast. I've gone into ESPN Plus. I've recorded the head clash. I've slowed it down. We are going to take a look at it in this video, and then we're going to discuss how it altered the fight. We are going to discuss how it relates to a much bigger problem in the UFC. We're going to discuss how Chris Curtis handled the loss against Kelvin Gastelum, and I'm also going to discuss what I believe is next for both men. Kelvin Gastelum, what's next for him, and what's next for Chris Curtis. Now, first off, I know people are going to comment down below and say I'm biased towards Chris Curtis because I know Chris Curtis, because I've done interviews with Chris Curtis, because I like Chris Curtis. Let me make this abundantly clear. Chris Curtis doesn't cut me a paycheck, okay? This is my honest opinion. If you want to say I'm biased towards him, so be it. But we're going to look at clear evidence, and I'm going to discuss how I felt like it affected the fight. And I just felt like it was being massively overlooked because in the co-main event, you had Congressman Jorge Masvidal retire. And in the main event, you had Israel Adesanya with a KO of a lifetime against Alex Pereira. So I feel like this moment is being forgotten about. And also because the UFC never showed the replay on the broadcast. Because had they shown the replay, more fans would be aware of it. Now, before we get into actually looking at the replay, how did I score the fight live? Live, I think it was pretty clear scoring. You had round one, it was clearly Kelvin Gastelum. There's no debate about that. Round three was clearly Chris Curtis. There's no debate about that. Even though the judges' scorecards, two judges had it 29-28 Kelvin Gastelum, and one judge had it 30-27 for Kelvin Gastelum. That judge needs to be fired immediately. There is no way that Kelvin Gastelum won that third round. There is absolutely no way that he won that third round. He clearly lost it. I don't know how a judge gave him it 30-27. So it really came down to the second round, and that's what makes this head clash so important. Because when I watched the second round live, I scored it for Kelvin Gastelum, but I thought it was razor close. I thought even with the sequence of the head clash, I thought that second round could have went either way. And when I actually went back and rewatched it, it was even closer than I remembered. When I went back and rewatched it, and maybe subconsciously I'm thinking about that head clash, and I want you guys to go do the same and let me know what you think. Go back and rewatch it. I thought Chris Curtis just barely edged out that second round, even with the head clash happening in the sequence that preceded the head clash. So it was a very close fight, but live I scored it 29-28 for Gastelum, not realizing about the head clash until the commentary team mentioned it. And then on rewatch, I thought it was 29-28 Curtis with the second and third round, but I thought it was razor close, and really I'm talking like 50-50 in that second round. That's how close it was. It was a flip of a coin. So now let's take a look at the replay of the sequence that happened in the second round. This was about midway through the second round where Chris Curtis lands a left hand, and then immediately after the left hand, Kelvin Gastelum goes down for a takedown, and then he brings his head up and clips Chris Curtis right on the chin. Now, this is a bad angle of the head clash, but his head comes up, clips the chin of Chris Curtis, and then Chris Curtis goes down to the ground, and then Kelvin Gastelum just swarms him with punches because Chris Curtis just isn't moving at all. And then after, maybe 15-20 seconds of him just absorbing ground and pound, he was kind of blocking him as well, but just sitting in place. Basically, it looked like he was unconscious. You have, Chris Curtis get back up, and then he proceeds to fight like he was fighting in the beginning of the round. And in the beginning of the round, he was winning that second round. He was landing good shots to the body. He was landing good punches to the head. And then after that sequence, I felt like the majority of the round on the back end of that sequence was also Chris Curtis, even though it was super close and competitive. Now, I do think this round was 50-50, but if you subtract that head clash, I believe this is unequivocally Chris Curtis's round. I don't think there's any debate about it. Therefore, Chris Curtis would have won this fight 29-28. And I think this is so unfortunate because you have a scenario where if this was any other fight, any big fight, any title fight, any number one contender fight, a main event on a pay-per-view card, this would have been talked about nonstop. Imagine if Adesanya did this and then won a pivotal round against Alex Pereira and won a decision. It would be everywhere. But because this was buried on the prelims, this basically got no attention and everyone just ignored it because essentially, you had so many bigger fights and bigger moments on the card that people forgot about it. By the time you got to Adesanya landing that unbelievable KO and then the celebration, people already forgot about, the prelim fights where there was a headbutt and it was kind of a controversial decision. So it's super unfortunate this happened because I do believe without that head clash, I do believe Chris Curtis would have gotten the second round on the judges' scorecards. It's just he sat there for 30 seconds, 15 to 30 seconds on the ground, taking unanswered shots, and then the rest of the round was about 50-50. So you take that, whole entire sequence into account and you subtract it out of the fight, it's Chris Curtis's round without a doubt. You go back to the Kevin Holland, what was it, Chris Daukaus or Kyle? It was Kyle Daukaus. You go back to that where they end up calling it a no contest. Even though it ended up being a submission after the head clash, the referee decided, you know what? Okay, there was a head clash here. It preceded the ending of the fight. Therefore, we need to make this a no contest. And supposedly Chris Curtis is going to appeal this. Is that going to go anywhere? Absolutely not. The referees and the judges have no accountability. Unless there is a call made right then and there, they will not change any decision ever. They don't like to admit fault at any point in time, even though there's a replay clearly showing a head clash. They are not going to overturn this result. Basically, appealing this to the commission is going to do absolutely nothing. And I think that's, a big problem within MMA and within the UFC is reffing and judging, but that's not the problem I was alluding to earlier in the video. The really massive problem we have here is the show and win money structure. Because now you have a scenario where essentially based on one move where this head inadvertently hits Chris Curtis and basically dazes him, knocks him out, whatever you want to call it, and cost him a round. Now it cost him the fight. It cost him half his paycheck. That is very unfortunate. What should have happened, and I'm not even blaming the ref in this scenario because, maybe he had bad positioning. He didn't see it. What are you going to do? But it's just very unfortunate because what should have happened is there should have been a break in action. There should have been a time for recovery for Chris Curtis. And basically, the judges should have been informed this was the result of a head clash. And then we would have had fairer judging scorecards going into that actual decision. And, now he's lost half his paycheck. And that's why I believe, a lot of people are saying, oh, you got to pay them their show and win because you got to incentivize them. They got to want to win. They can't just want to show up for a check. There's guys that just show up for a paycheck now regardless. They don't care. They'll just show up for half a paycheck. I believe these guys are going out there, putting their health on the line, putting their life on the line. One wrong punch, next thing you know, you're dead. And I believe you shouldn't be able to lose half your paycheck on an errant referee decision, on an errant judge's scorecard. I mean, how many times have we seen that? Even on this card, Michelle Waterson got brutally robbed on this card. She clearly won that fight, and she got robbed by the judges. And I think that is a massive issue in the UFC. And I know some of the bigger, stars within the UFC get a flat rate just to show up. They get $1 million to show up plus pay-per-view points. But I think it's really time at some point the UFC starts paying some of these guys flat rates to show up because essentially the commission half the time is robbing these guys of half their paycheck. Now, if you look at what happened after the fact, Chris Curtis went online. He was complaining nonstop to a bunch of different people online, random people, fans. He went on the MMA Hour. He was complaining there. I do understand the frustration. 100% I understand the frustration. But at the same time, that's not a good look at all. People are going to say, oh, he's salty. He's a sore loser, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. But I'm sympathetic to him because he lost half his paycheck. And again, I don't think it's a good look because essentially it just looks like he's making excuses after a loss. But it's a legitimate excuse. And if this was your favorite fighter, if this was Alex Pereira this happened to, everyone would be up in arms. If this was Tony Ferguson this happened to, everyone would be up in arms. If this was Conor McGregor, everyone would be up in arms. Think about even Colby Covington, all the complaints that Colby Covington had after he got TKO'd by Kamaru Usman. He got finished. He didn't just lose on the judges' scorecards. He got finished. He complained and his fans complained. Back of the head shots on the finish, early stoppage, fake nut shots. Every excuse under the book why he got stopped by Usman in the 5th round. They're still regurgitating those excuses to this day. So because Chris Curtis versus Kelvin Gastelum wasn't a main event of a fight night card, wasn't a big fight on the UFC 287 pay-per-view portion of the card, this is just forgotten about. And I really think there should be something done about it. I don't know what can be done. Maybe the UFC could pay him, his win money. But at the end of the day, you don't know. Maybe he was going to lose anyway. The second round was still very close. I think it turned on that head clash. And I think this is one of those situations where essentially this is going to be forgotten about by everyone except Chris Curtis. And we're going to have to move on. And they're just going to book other fights because Chris Curtis wants this rematch badly. And I'm going to try to get Chris Curtis back on the channel maybe in the next week or two. If you watch this, Chris, let me know down in the comments if you want to come back on the channel. But I think, he's going to want the rematch, but I don't think he's going to get it. The UFC needs contenders in the middleweight division. Kelvin Gastelum has a history with Israel Adesanya. I think they're going to push Kelvin Gastelum on to another fight. Up the division, try to sell that story against Adesanya. I think Kelvin Gastelum could be one fight away, depending on what happens with Israel Adesanya in the division, from getting a potential title shot. As crazy as that sounds, from number 15 to 2 fights later, fighting for a title, I think that's a real possibility because of the lack of contenders that Israel Adesanya has not fought in the division. But what do I think will be next for each guy? I believe the UFC will book next for Kelvin Gastelum. I think there's a couple options. I think, you really could go a bunch of different options, but I believe the UFC will book Kelvin Gastelum versus Sean Strickland. Sean Strickland just stepped in for Kelvin Gastelum back in January, beat Nasruddin Imavov. Kelvin Gastelum just beat his teammate, Chris Curtis. It makes perfect sense. And Sean Strickland's ranked up there, in the top 10. If Kelvin Gastelum can go out there and get a win over Sean Strickland, puts him right back in the title picture. Alex Pereira got a title shot off beating Sean Strickland. So I think that is the fight they will most likely make for Kelvin Gastelum. They could rebook that Dricus du Plessis fight. I don't think that's going to happen. I think Dricus du Plessis is going to get fed to Hamzat or get fed to Alex Pereira if he stays at 185. Or there's a chance they even feed Dricus du Plessis to Israel Adesanya because of the lack of contenders. Now, as far as where does Chris Curtis go from here, what's next for Chris Curtis? I believe most likely we will see Chris Curtis versus Andre Muniz. It makes perfect sense right now because Andre Muniz just lost to Brendan Allen. Chris Curtis just lost to Kelvin Gastelum. They're very similar spots in the rankings. I think Andre Muniz is number 14. Chris Curtis is number 15, which is crazy because Brendan Allen's like number 12 or 13, and Chris Curtis just beat Brendan Allen not that long ago. So the rankings are a little bit wonky. But I think that is the fight to make. I think we will see Chris Curtis versus Andre Muniz next, probably, in the summertime or early fall. I think that's the fight the UFC is going to aim for. Or they could do Chris Curtis versus Nasruddin Imavov. That is another option. Nasruddin Imavov just lost to Sean Strickland, who is Chris Curtis's partner. I think that is a fight that the UFC could book as well. But this is just a terrible situation. And I really think what Chris Curtis needs to do after this, and I don't know if it's a real possibility because it all depends on the UFC schedule. Chris Curtis needs to find a way to get 5-round fights because, in that Jack Hermanson fight that he took on short notice, he won the 3rd round and the momentum was starting to shift in his favor. In that Kelvin Gastelum fight, had this been a 5-round fight, I don't think we'd be talking about it because I think Chris Curtis would have probably gotten a finish in the 4th or 5th round. He was really starting to come on strong in that 3rd round. So if I'm Chris Curtis's manager, I'm trying my damnedest to get a fight night card main event, 5 rounds, because Chris Curtis thrives in the longer the fight goes. He's always looking good in the 3rd rounds. And I just think it's unfortunate that this happened in this fight. But overall, was still a great fight in the middleweight division. I'm happy to see Kelvin Gastelum get a win, even though there is unfortunate circumstances. And I do believe this would have been a bigger issue had it not been on such a big card. And also had it not been missed by the commentary team and had the UFC broadcast actually shown the replay. I think this would be more talked about from MMA fans about this head clash. But ultimately now you're hearing more criticism of Chris Curtis speaking out on it than you're hearing about, okay, this fight, this 2nd round is basically tainted because of an illegal foul, or, you know, I'm not saying that Kelvin Gastelum did it intentionally, but an unintentional foul happened and it affected the outcome of the fight. It's no different than an eye poke or a groin shot. It basically put Chris Curtis out, and then therefore he ended up losing the decision. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. You know, how do you feel about all this? Should they book a rematch? I'd totally be down for a rematch. I'd love to see the fight rebooked for a 5-round rematch. It's not going to happen. But let me know down in the comments what you guys think. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.